Hi, geographers. We are on video 1.7, and this standard is about regional analysis. So here's what College Board tells me to tell you. Your objective here is that you should be able to describe different ways that geographers define regions. There are three major types of regions that we are going to discuss here, but regions can be discussed at different scales, which we've previously talked about scale, and regional boundaries are not always 100%, black and white. Basically, these boundaries can oftentimes be overlapping or what we like to call like fuzzy. And so it's important to remember moving forward that regions are a tool that geographers use to talk about spatial analysis. And we're going to kind of think about the ways in which you can identify those regions. So, first things first is the whole world can be divided into regions, right? And so you can see these are the most common regions that the College Board uses in the way that they word questions or they ask for responses. And so by the end of this year, you'll need to be familiar with these regions, these kind of global regions. And you can notice here, of course, Europe isn't on this map, but you'll need to know that Europe is an important place in the world and a region itself. And so we'll kind of come back to this a lot. So, as I said, geographers are going to apply this regional analysis at the different scales that we've talked about. Remember, the scale of analysis. We can look at local regions, national regions, obviously regional is on here, and then global regions, right? And so I'm going to provide you with a couple of different examples of those. So what is a region? Right? According to geographers, a region is defined by an area that has one or more unifying characteristics or patterns of activity. The three types of regions are formal regions, functional regions, and vernacular or perceptual. They mean the same thing. So when you're thinking about a region, it's just an area of space where something is the same. And so you can see the map that I've provided here. These are regions of NFL fans in the United States. And so a formal region is the kind of most simple explanation of a region. It's united by one or more specific traits. And usually those traits are one of these four. They're economic, social, political, or environmental. So let's talk about what an economic region would be. Remember, it's unified by one or more similar characteristics or traits. And so if you take a look at this map of the European Union, all of these countries that are dark blue, or you can see the two lighter colors of blue, are countries that are either in the European Union or in the process of joining the European Union. And you can see that the UK is there as a former member. They are no longer a part of the European Union. And when we think about this in terms of a region, right, what does the European Union, all of these countries, what do they all have in common? Well, first of all, they all adhere to this policy of free trade, right? There's also a lot of open migration, right? So there aren't really borders among the countries. You can go from Spain to France without having to stop at Border Patrol and show your passport and being searched, and all of that. Movement is fluid, trade is fluid, and all of these countries use the same currency, the euro. And so that's why we would call this an economic region. And this is because trade and currency have to do with money, right? Buying and selling. Here's an example of a social or cultural formal region, the Islamic world. When we look at this map, you can see that the darker the color green is the larger percentage of people in that country that practice Islam. The lighter the color, the less amount of people in that country practice Islam. And so you can see by looking at this map that there's a pretty definite region right here in Northern Africa, Southwest Asia, some of South and Central Asia, where Islam is the majority. And so this is a social or cultural region because it is based on adherence to a religion. A religion is something that is cultural. And then finally, a political region, if we go kind of back to looking at Europe, this is just having to do with territories and boundaries. And so the states and capitals in Europe are all political. So a political region would be Europe itself. Finally, environmental regions. Remember, physical landscape is the same thing, or natural landscape, that's the same thing as environmental. And so this formal region is identified by the Sahara Desert. Right? The Sahara Desert is this kind of region at the in northern Africa that separates northern Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. Sub meaning under the Sahara. And so this is an environmental formal region. So just to review before we move on, the main idea that you need to know here is that a formal region has one or more specific characteristics in common, and it's typically an economic, social, political, or environmental characteristic. So next up, we have a functional region. A functional region is organized around a central node, a focal point, a function. And the relationship of that region is based around economics, travel, or communication. And so, examples of functional regions: the 275 loop in Cincinnati, right? 275 is this circle that basically connects all of the suburbs in Cincinnati. This is a functional region because it is based around travel routes, right? The function is travel. Another example of a functional region you can see is the subway of New York. Again, focused around travel. This is flight patterns in the United States. Again, focused around travel, right? So one way to remember the difference between that functional region and the formal region is that there's some kind of central node, there's some sort of central point that kind of connects the outer points, right? So the central point here is Cincinnati, that's connecting all of these suburbs. The central point here is New York City, right? And then you can see all of these central points where you see the most flights occurring in the United States as well. Here's another example of a functional region, and this one's used in examples oftentimes, television or radio markets, right? These markets are focused around a broadcast signal, right? And so that itself is the node, and the node kind of spreads out to be that common characteristic of, a TV channel that's available or a radio station that's available. Okay, the last type of region is called perceptual or vernacular. And so when you think about the word perceptual, it comes from perception, right? And so it has to do with people's perspectives, right? It's based on a person's perspective or their perception of a certain location or area. Okay. It's opinion based, it's in people's minds, it's very informal, right? What I think and what you think might be completely different. So, oftentimes when we're thinking about perceptual or vernacular regions, we need to think about the concepts of sense of place, right? What sense does this region give me? And is it the same as the sense that it gives you? Right? What is my cultural identity? What is the cultural identity of the region that I'm looking at? And so, because of all of these regions, or I'm sorry, all of these perspectives, right? The boundaries of perceptual regions are kind of different for every single person. Every person is going to have a different sense of what is defining or uniting these regions and where the boundaries begin and end. And so, the greatest example of a perceptual region is, what is the South, right? In the United States, when we say, oh, yeah, they're in the South, what do we mean by that? Well, there are a lot of different criteria that we could use to determine what the South actually is. And so if you look at this map, it's showing us 5 different kind of definitions or boundary lines of what people consider the South. So when I say the South to you, what does it mean? Well, to some people, it means states that were in the Confederacy during the Civil War, right? And so that is a very specific line to look at on this map. And you can kind of see it's this like dark blue line here. Um, some people would say that the South is a region in the United States that is united by the fact that they are below average in high school and college graduation rates, right? And so, again, you can kind of use that as a factor to determine, okay, what is the South? Right to work states, not a lot of winter precipitation, mostly Baptist in religion. There's a lot of different ways that people could define this region. It's kind of the same with the Midwest. What do you mean by Midwest? Where does it start? Where does it end? What is the criteria that you're using in order to determine that something is the Midwest or the South? It's different based on who you talk to. So, kind of that leads us into this conversation about, you know, regional boundaries are never going to be perfect, right? So, the perceptual ones are the ones that are going to always be really, really fuzzy and really based on people's opinions and perspectives. However, even formal and functional regions, they're transitional, which means they change a lot. They're contested, which means, some people may argue that they begin here and end here, and others may argue something completely different. And oftentimes they overlap. So, again, when we're talking about like regions in the United States, here are 2 different examples of what people would classify as the different regions in the US. Which one's right? There is no right or wrong a lot of times. But what you do need to know for sure is the definitions of the 3 types of regions and some really concrete examples of those. Here's another example of how regions can be overlapping or contested, right? Um, if you look at this circle right here, right, Mexico is actually a part of North America. However, oftentimes it gets grouped in with South America because of the similar cultural characteristics that these people have in common. And so, oftentimes geographers will refer to, Mexico and below, which includes the Caribbean, as Latin America, right? But this Mexico area is also part of the region of North America. The Caribbean is kind of a region in itself, but again, it shares cultural characteristics with South America and Mexico. So that is why oftentimes the Caribbean is kind of linked in to create this kind of overlapping Latin America. Another example is Egypt right here. Oftentimes, geographers are going to put Egypt into the Middle East region, right? However, Egypt is a part of Africa. And so Why isn't it a part of the North Africa region, right? Again, regions aren't always perfect. Another example is right here in the middle. Places like Pakistan oftentimes find themselves in a really precarious situation because they're technically in the region of South Asia. However, they're a majority Muslim, so they more identify with people in Central Asia or the Middle East. So I realize you're probably like, whoa, Miss B, like that's way too much. I don't even know what you're talking about. But the idea here is, right, that you're understanding that regions can change. They are contested, meaning that people kind of fight back and forth about them and they're overlapping. Okay, so that's the end of our video. Like always, you need to save questions for me to ask me in person in class. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.